Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this new lecture in our series on World History 2. So we're picking up after a pretty monumental event in World War I. And what we're going to do is we're going to sort of touch base with what happens in Asia in the aftermath of World War I, specifically focusing on two contexts. I'd like to look at what happens to China and Japan between the wars. What you'll notice about this unit, Unit 3 of this class, is that we're kind of going to do a similar exercise to what we did in Unit 1. Only instead of sort of getting every country to 1648, what we're going to try to do is going to get all of our major players of World War II to the eve of World War II. And that means we're going to start with China and Japan, and then we're going to go on to Russia, we're going to go on to Italy, we're going to go on to Germany. So, the last time we talked about China, you may remember, it was the context of imperialism. We had talked about China as a sort of, dare I say, post-imperial nation. A nation that was, officially speaking, an empire, but was in practice entering a really strong period of decline following the Opium Wars with Great Britain. Now, of course, we looked at these events from the perspective of the British in the context of imperialism, but we didn't talk about what this meant for the larger context of China. In fact, it's really improper to even refer to this period of China as China. I think it'd be more proper to think of it as the Qing dynasty, the Great Qing, as Chinese historians call it. One of our last remaining gunpowder empires alongside the Russian Empire. But in the aftermath of imperialism, the Great Qing begins its period of decline. Overall, the repeated humiliation that the Qing emperors, the Qing and China in general, experiences during this period of time. Chinese historians refer to this as the century of humiliation, where China goes from being sort of in their mind anyway, the preeminent world power to not just even one power among many, but a fairly bit part player in the grand scheme of things. Repeated humiliation in the context of the Opium Wars. The great takeaway, the takeaway that the Qing emperors take from this, is that China must change. That if China does not adapt to the times in which they find themselves, China will go the way of the dodo. That China will collapse, essentially. And so begins a process of modernization of Chinese society. Not so much of Chinese politics, but of Chinese society. The implementation of things like industrialization gets brought to China. Sort of more modern society, or at least more Western modern societies, as a model, get brought to China. The problem is that, of course, Chinese citizens are not super thrilled with this. In fact, quite the opposite. The average citizen in China sort of views this as not so much an abrogation of duty, but as an admittance that what they were doing, China was on the wrong track. And so they sort of have a really emotional response to it. And they do this by sort of fully embracing their culture. By saying, no, we are not going to let our emperor change who we are. This is China, and we're going to behave like that. We are going to embrace our culture. We're going to embrace our traditions. And so this comes in the form of a very unique form of civil protest. The conservative Chinese population begins to perform, as a form of civil disobedience, Tai Chi in public spaces. As a way to sort of, not so much to do civil disobedience, but to disrupt society. Because, yes, a whole bunch of people doing Tai Chi in the park is nice and inspiring. A whole bunch of people doing Tai Chi at the DMV sort of gets in the way. And that's sort of the idea. To sort of do this full-throated endorsement, bear hug of their own culture, and as a way to do some sort of protest and civil disobedience. The problem is, of course, that for the first time, we have British observers in China, in mainland China, looking at this and sort of not understanding what they're seeing. And the British observers, come to say that those who are performing Tai Chi are practicing, quote-unquote, boxing. That's what they're doing. This is not a sort of borderline martial arts / meditative practice, that this is just boxing that they're doing, that they're practicing. And ironically, these citizens sort of take this on as almost a badge of honor, as to say, oh my God, these ignorant Europeans, these ignorant Westerners, they don't even know what we're doing. They take on the name boxers almost as a way to make fun of the people that don't understand what's going on here. Problem is that the march of progress is inevitable to some degree. And so as the Qing Emperor begins to bring in a whole bunch of ideas surrounding society, ironically, this is setting up the framework for their own collapse. Because you cannot modernize a society without modernizing its politics. Or at the very least, the conceptions that people have around their politics. You cannot have your cake and eat it too. If you want a mass industrialized society, well then you're going to import the politics of a mass industrialized society. And absolutist emperors don't really have a place there. And so sure enough, with an already weak Qing emperor and this sort of modernization of Chinese society as a whole, revolution becomes inevitable. In fact, in the lead up to World War I, China experiences the first revolution of the 20th century. This is the 1911 revolution. The revolution that brings the emperor out of power. This is going to be something you're going to see happen very similarly in Russia in our next week's class. But what ends up happening is the first revolution in China is a revolution against what people perceive to be sort of the antiquated version of their government. This antiquated system. As such, it's very apolitical. This was not a revolution for a cause. This is a revolution to get rid of this sort of outdated mode of government and replace it with a more modern sort of government. Because as the Qing modernized, as the Qing sort of embraced the Western way of doing things in their economy and in their productive processes, they also brought in Western ideas surrounding government and power. And ultimately, that's what causes the revolution. Now, the grandfather of the revolution is this man. Sun Yat-sen is his name. And guys, no notes. This might be one of the first unadulterated 10 out of 10 sort of good beans of the class. No note, no skeletons that I know of in his closet. Sun Yat-sen might be sort of the first genuinely decent person that we're looking at as part of this class. So who is he? Well, Sun Yat-sen is born in 1866, okay? So smack in the middle of the century of humiliation for China, okay? Right in between the two opium wars. You have to think, he's also in southern China. He witnesses, as he's growing up, firsthand the impact that the opium, the lead up to the opium wars and sort of the baggage that came with that had on southern China. And so he's inspired to be a doctor, to sort of treat these very sick people in his community. But there's a problem. Sun Yat-sen wants to do medicine in the new Western style of doing medicine. Late 1800s, this is the early frontier of modern medicine, and Sun Yat-sen wants to participate. The problem is, of course, that China has its own medical tradition, traditional Eastern medicine. And he finds himself just getting increasingly frustrated because he sees coming in from the West new ideas, new techniques that might genuinely help people, and is being told that he can't do them because it would go against the traditions of China. And it gets him so mad that he eventually just drops out of school to become a revolutionary. And so between 1888 and 1911, the year of revolution, Sun Yat-sen would alternate between periods in China where he's organizing, then he would get caught, get exiled, goes abroad. Usually he goes abroad to Southeast Asia, so southern Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia. But you have to remember that this region, this area is mostly controlled by the Dutch East India Company. So when he goes to Southeast Asia, he is exposed to, ironically, more Western ideas. So when he comes back, he's bringing these new ideas with him. It's like he's going to professional development for being a revolutionary over and over and over again every time he gets exiled. Now, Sun Yat-sen's main proposal is that for China to succeed in getting rid of the emperor, China needs unity. China needs to sort of take all of its disparate factions and unify them as a cohesive movement. That there was no sort of communists and anti-communists in China. There was those who were pro the emperor and those who were against the emperor. Okay? There's no liberals and nationalists and socialists and anarchists in China. He is the one that really sort of turns it into this sort of black and white dichotomy. Either you're for the emperor or you're against the emperor. Because none of these factions can exist in a world where the emperor is in charge. And so all of these various sort of nascent political movements kind of put their differences aside at Sun Yat-sen's urging to join in the battle against the emperor. And sure enough, because Sun Yat-sen is the central figure, when the revolution happens, Sun Yat-sen is made the first emperor of the Chinese Republic. Now you might be thinking, great, this is going to last a long time. Nope. 5 years. Because remember, just because Sun Yat-sen and company are willing to modernize, don't forget that China is still full of those boxers that we were talking about that are really, really, really unwilling to change. Why should China have to change? That means politically too. These guys love their emperor. And Sun Yat-sen's main model is candidly Great Britain. Sun Yat-sen's idea is to keep the Qing emperor sort of alive and in power as a figurehead, but leave all political authority to an elected parliament. That means, though, that the emperor is still around to endorse politics and to push his thumb on the scale. As such, the Qing emperor basically creates this sort of reactionary movement in China that culminates in the nomination and eventual victory of Yuan Shikai as China's second ever president. And I have to think this broke Sun Yat-sen's heart, because Yuan Shikai is the polar opposite of Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen is an educated and articulate intellectual. Yuan Shikai is an idiot. From what we understand, he is barely literate, if not actively illiterate. He comes from a noble family. He is very conservative and seems to have embraced from the Western tradition the wrong sort of thing. Okay? Because instead of embracing the idea that, hey, let's bring in Western politics, let's bring in democracy and republic, all that fun stuff. Let's bring in voting. No. Yuan Shikai brings in Western militarism. That he thinks that's the only thing, because the Europeans beat us on the battlefield, we need to adapt their military. And yet, with the Qing emperor on his side, Yuan Shikai is able to become China's second ever democratically elected leader. And again, I think this broke Sun Yat-sen's heart, especially because Yuan Shikai is so monumentally bad at his job that China breaks apart under his tenureship. Almost immediately. Yuan Shikai sort of takes this beautiful little Humpty Dumpty that Sun Yat-sen had built and threw it off the wall and broke it up into this. Areas of subdivided warlord and political control. Okay? China is divided. China will stay this way for a pretty long time. Over a decade. Okay? We talked about World War I in Europe, and you might ask, why wasn't China involved in World War I? Well, this is the reason. China is sort of temporarily closed for repair at the moment. China is closed for business at the moment. It would take a now octogenarian Sun Yat-sen to return to China and to try to reunify the country once more. Only this time, it's a lot more difficult. Because the first time he did it, there was an emperor that nobody liked that he was able to coalesce all of the factions around. But now the emperor is gone, or at least not in power anymore. And so what you have instead is Sun Yat-sen dealing with the other factions of China, namely Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, or the Communist Party and the Nationalist Party, okay? The Comintern and the Kuomintang, as they came to be called, the Communists and the Nationalists. But listen, both of these men, in spite of their differences, have enormous respect for Sun Yat-sen, because Sun Yat-sen is this elderly grandfather figure for China, right? So he is the guy that convinces them to sort of put their differences aside, at least temporarily, and to unify China. China is back on the path of unification, but Sun Yat-sen will die. Old age. He's just old at this point. And ultimately, there is only so much unity can do. Okay? Sometimes differences need to get resolved. And so now what you see here is from a begrudging alliance, this is going to turn into an active enmity. Now, between these two, who's going to make the first move? The answer is the nationalists. It is the nationalists that make the first move in China to take control. And so, first content warning of the class, because Chiang Kai-shek decides that the way to sort of deal with the problem, quote unquote, of communism was extreme brutality. Remember, these guys had fought together. These guys knew who each other were. These guys were allies. The nationalists and the communists were aware of each other. The nationalists knew where the communists hung out. They knew where the communist headquarters was. Knew where prominent communist members individually lived. And Kuomintang, the Chiang Kai-shek movement, had been keeping a list. And on the day in Shanghai, they begin to round up all communists and, more importantly, suspected communists in the city. Round them up, march them in the street, bring them to the central square of the city, and there, one by one, proceed to behead them. This is one of the most graphic photographs that I'm going to show you as part of this class, in which a British official was able to capture the snapshot of a beheading happening mid-beheading. I put this in here, I include this, because you need to see what this looked like. The shock factor of this. Okay? 10,000 communists and their sympathizers are all beheaded on this day. Now, for Kai-shek, the brutality of this was the point. This was the goal, right? To scare the communists into submission. The problem is there was a line that was crossed multiple blocks ago to which most of Kai-shek's own allies think, whoa, what are you doing? They're also executed for being, communist sympathizers, essentially. This event in Shanghai is the start of the Chinese Civil War. This event kicks off the Chinese Civil War because on this day, officially speaking, Kai-shek may have taken control politically, but in practice, long term, it's really difficult for Kai-shek to go around saying, support us, we're the good guys, when they've just beheaded 10,000 people in the street. Okay? So in the short term, yes, it gives Kai-shek immediate access to political power, undeniably. But in the long term, it makes Mao's Communist Party all the more sympathetic to your average citizen of China. Okay? And as Mao's party overall begins to sort of escape the main cities and go off into the fields and to establish communities and urban centers outside of Shanghai, they begin to create their own militia. Okay? Their own version of the Russian Red Army, if you will. One that is sort of a little more guerrilla warfare than active militancy, but still, Kai-shek is able to frame this as the communists in my country have a military, have weapons, and they're willing and able to come confront me. And so Kai-shek turns to Europe. A Europe that is now deathly afraid of the Soviet Union, I would add. 1927, Soviets are a thing, Stalin is a thing. And so he basically puts out this public appeal and says, hey, there might be a second communist takeover in China. Please help me. I'll give you 3 guesses. Which European leader in the 1930s bites this sort of fishing lure? Because that's right. In one of our second most insane photographs of the class, here is Chiang Kai-shek meeting 1 Adolf Hitler, who pledges to provide China with the resources it needs to ensure that communism not arrive in China. There's an alternate story. There's an alternate history in the universe, in the multiverse of madness, where China, not Japan, becomes the next Axis power. Now, regardless, with the help of Nazi military support, Kai-shek undertakes a policy of what he comes to call encirclement. The idea was, if they thought that there was a village or a town that had some elements of communist resistance in there, that the town would be surrounded by Kai-shek's army, by the armies of the Chinese nationalists, and everyone inside that radius would be executed, right? To cast as wide a net as possible. This is an existential threat. Okay? Now, of course, a lot of, everyday civilians are caught up in this, but I don't think Kai-shek really cares at this point. This leads to, I think, the moment. Every revolution has a moment. Valley Forge, storming of the Bastille. The moment of despair that leads to optimism. For the Chinese Revolution, that is this: the Long March North. It is not a victory by any stretch of the imagination. What this is an escape. Okay? It is an escape away from absolute disaster, from an absolute beating, from an absolute loss. Mao is able to take his forces and move his way north to live to fight another day. Okay? Yes, at its core, the Long March is a retreat. It is a tactical retreat. It's not what you would expect to be the moment. But it crystallizes this moment in time. People remember, these are who the Chinese nationalists are. This is what we should be scared of. Okay? The communists live to fight another day. And they make their way to northern China to regroup, resettle, and start again. And right as they're about to do round 2, Mao, who cannot catch a break, is attacked from the other side. Because at this point, we have hit 1937. And China is about to be invaded by the north. From the north. By Japan. Honestly, Mao cannot catch a break. Which means that the Chinese Civil War, Chinese Revolution, kind of has to go like time out because World War II happens. The Chinese Civil War is not going to get resolved until after World War II. Largely because both Kai-shek and Mao have to deal with the problem of Japan. we should probably talk about Japan. Because, let's rewind. Japan's story with imperialism is remarkably similar to that of China's. Japan is also forcibly brought into the Western trading system. Not by Britain, but by the United States. We talked about Admiral Matthew Perry's, let's just say, not so kind request to have Japan open to foreign trade. This kicks off a series of events that we're going to call the Meiji Restoration. It is very similar to what the Qing tried to do. I would argue a little more successfully. I think there's a lot of reasons why what the Chinese do incorrectly, the Japanese do correctly. Number one, I think it had to do with the fact that the emperor in Japan had not been in charge for a very long time. If you know your Japanese history, you'll know that in the aftermath of the Warring States period, Japan was sort of ruled in practice by the shogun, not the emperor. Okay? So, most people living in Japan understood that the person responsible for Japan's humiliation by Western powers was not the emperor, because the emperor had no power. The emperor was just a figurehead. It's like the monarch of England. The problem was the shogun, and the shogun they get rid of. The Meiji Restoration means the restoration of the Japanese emperor to power. Okay? They get rid of the shogunate, and they basically turn the emperor into this sort of organizing figure around industrialization. Japan begins to industrialize very, very, very rapidly. It's like gentrification, but on steroids. Because people living in Japan literally felt that their world was changing before their eyes. What makes it different to China is that in China there was the pushback. In China there were the boxers. The people saying, no, we can't change. We're China. We're the best. How can we do this? For Japan, this led to nationalism. Because the Japanese think it took the Europeans a century or more to do what we're doing in maybe a decade and a half. We're clearly better than the Europeans. So you pair this with some historical views that the Japanese had on their own superiority. Rapid modernization. What you end up seeing in Japan is instead of the route, Japan taking sort of the route to communism, Japan is on the route to fascism. An imperialistic fascism that culminates with the most important event, war you've never heard of. Even though this war is kind of like the 7 Years' War of the 20th century and that impacts a lot of things, this is the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. Okay? Russia and Japan get into a conflict largely over sort of territorial control of the northwestern Pacific, essentially. That corner of where Japan and Russia is, both by sea and by land. Japan wins the Russo-Japanese War. Now, that puts Russia down its own sort of path to national humiliation. But for the Japanese, this just validates all of their opinions. Up until a few decades ago, people in Japan were fighting with muskets and swords. Now here they are slugging it out with the biggest army in Europe and winning. It is a turning point. It validates all of their ideas that they were innately better at whatever this industrialization and imperialism thing was. They were better at it than the Europeans. And so, since Japan is now speed running their way to imperialism, Japan sort of begins its own path to imperialism, taking over its neighbors. They seize Korea, they seize Taiwan, they seize Okinawa, and they seize the Sakhalin Islands which is this sort of very long-shaped island north of Japan. It's now part of Russia. Japan begins to view itself not so much as a fully imperial power, but as a Pacific power. They begin to view, sort of in the same way the United States viewed all of the sort of the lower 48 as part of, sort of their manifest destiny to control this land from sea to shining sea. Japan views it as their destiny to control the Pacific from coast to shining coast. Okay? So taking over Korea is just part of this. And then there's a war, World War I. And a lot of these islands in the Pacific belong to Germany. So Japan enters the war on the pretense of taking over former German colonial possessions in the Pacific, something that they will receive at the Treaty of Versailles. Japan is sort of very quickly becoming a preeminent Pacific power. And I would highlight, it has been less than 50 years from Matthew Perry entering the port of Tokyo, the port of Musashi at the time, to Japan becoming a preeminent world power in the Pacific. If you're in Japan living through this moment, you begin to you're starting to believe your own hype. In fact, Japan is invited to the conference at the Treaty of Versailles, where the great powers of the world began to think amongst themselves what the future of post-World War I was going to be. It's like, Thanksgiving is coming up. I'm sure you've all had this moment in your life where, once upon a time you were sitting at the kids' table, and then one year you were invited to sit with the adults. The determination you might come to is, oh my God, I am an adult. If you are invited to the conference with all the world major powers, you might start to think of yourself as a major power. And again, I want to point out how remarkable this is. Because this is a country that had been the subject of imperialism not even a century earlier, that was now conducting diplomacy with all the big powers of the world. You might leave that thinking that Japan is a big major power of the world. So it starts acting like it. Japan begins a conquest of sort of all of the territories in its immediate neighborhood. But the prize is the area just north of Korea, Manchuria, the province that the Japanese would call Manchukuo. Manchuria is chosen very intentionally. You see, the Qing dynasty of China was originally sort of the great power of Asia, right? China viewed itself as the great power of Asia. Well, they were from Manchuria originally. That was like their home state, if you will. When the Japanese storm into Manchuria and seize it, they are telling the world that they are the new top dogs of Asia. This, for many historians, might be the genuine beginning of World War II, where Japan begins a war of conquest in China, a country in political turmoil, because remember, this is in the middle of World War II, in the middle of the Chinese Civil War. And the results are catastrophic. The results are disastrous, because the Japanese unleash a level of fury on China that has rarely been matched in world history. And so, I'm going to close off this lecture on one of the more disturbing pictures of the class. I've already shown you a couple. But for me, this is the one that always gets me. Remember how I said that in World War I, we had all these new toys and no rules around how to use them, and so we went buck wild? Japan was never part of that, the wars formally. It participates in World War I. But Japan's not in the trenches, not really. So Japan is still on that high. only now with fascism, the deadly combination. Japan views it as a moral necessity to punish China by using some of the most sadistic inventions of all mankind. It is the Japanese that first introduced the world to the military applications of napalm. And so, final content warning of the class. If you don't want to see the next picture, tap out now. I will see you all next week, but this is the aftermath of what the Japanese do to the province of Nanking. It is an event so terrible that the historians have come to refer to this as the Rape of Nanking. I'll give you 3 guesses as to why. It is an event so horrific that even today it strains relations between China and Japan. China and Japan still have a very strained relationship, largely because of this event. It's similar sort of pot as Turkey and Armenia having something of a strained relationship. But this might be sort of the first big atrocity of World War II. We're going to see how these couple of decades, the 20s and 30s, will proceed in the aftermath of World War I. I did warn you in our last class that this unit would reach sort of the darkest and lowest points of this class. I wasn't kidding. So next week, we're going to have a doubleheader on the Russian Revolution and Stalin. I'll see you for it. You guys should be working on Darkness at Noon for next week, Friday. I will see you then. Bye, everyone.